What if I told you that certain people walk among us with a fundamentally different operating system? One that grants them a paradoxical advantage in the social arena, specifically in the domain of attraction and influence. Not because they're more moral, more attractive, or even more intelligent, but because they've evolved or developed a psychological architecture that renders them immune to the very mechanisms that control you. Welcome to Neural Capital. Today, we dissect the Dark Triad, the Predator's toolkit hidden in plain sight.
The advantage paradox. Let's establish something controversial. In the domain of dark seduction, empathy is not an asset, it's a liability. And here's why this matters neurologically. When most individuals enter romantic or sexual dynamics, they activate what we call the attachment circuitry. The ventral tegmental area floods with dopamine, the anterior cingulate cortex monitors for social pain, and oxytocin creates bonding imperatives. You become invested, you become vulnerable. But the dark triad individual, they're running different firmware. The core principle. Their advantage stems from a personality construct that prioritizes autonomy over intimacy, not as a choice, but as a constitutional reality. They don't resist attachment, they simply don't experience the neurochemical cascade that creates it. This isn't about being damaged or broken. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, these traits may represent a frequency-dependent selection strategy, effective precisely because they're rare in the population.
Narcissism, the armor system. Let's deconstruct the first gear, narcissism. Surface function. Grandiose self-perception, entitlement, and an insatiable need for admiration. But here's what your psychology textbook won't tell you. Narcissism operates as a defensive fortification system, what clinicians call fragile high self-esteem. The mechanism. The narcissist maintains an inflated self-image, not through genuine confidence, but through a process called external validation hijacking. They've outsourced their self-worth regulation to the social environment. This creates a paradox. They appear supremely confident, yet require constant narcissistic supply, admiration, attention, validation to maintain homeostasis. Neurological substrate. MRI studies show reduced gray matter in the anterior insula, the region responsible for emotional empathy and self-awareness. This creates what researchers call emotional myopia, an inability to accurately perceive how one's behavior affects others. In dark seduction context, this armor provides three tactical advantages. First, approach immunity. Because their self-worth is externalized, rejection doesn't penetrate. They can approach with zero inhibition because the ego-protective shell deflects social risk. Second, charismatic mimicry. The need for admiration forces them to become exceptional performers. They develop what Dr. Delroy Paulus calls short-term attractiveness, the ability to create powerful first impressions through charm, humor, and confidence projection. Third, the devaluation cycle. Once supply is secured, the target loses novelty. The narcissist's interest evaporates, not through malice, but through neurochemical habituation. They must seek new sources of validation. They don't fall in love with you. They fall in love with your reflection of them.
Now we reach the cognitive engine of the Dark Triad, Machiavellianism, the strategic engine. If narcissism is the armor, Machiavellianism is the weapons system. Definition: a dispositional strategy characterized by cynical worldview, emotional detachment, and calculated manipulation for self-interest. But here's the critical insight. High Macs don't view manipulation as amoral, they view it as realistic. They've adopted what social psychologists call a game-theoretic model of human interaction. To them, social life is not a cooperative venture. It's a zero-sum competition for resources, status, sex, money, power. Cognitive architecture. Research by Jones and Paulhus reveals that high Macs exhibit hyper-developed theory of mind. They're exceptional at modeling others' mental states, not for empathy, but for exploitation. They can predict your reactions, identify your vulnerabilities, and craft behavioral interventions accordingly. Reduced moral emotional reactivity. Functional MRI studies show dampened activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex when processing moral violations. They understand social rules intellectually, but feel no emotional compulsion to follow them. Long-term strategic thinking. Unlike impulsive psychopaths, Machiavellians can delay gratification and execute complex, multi-stage manipulation schemes. In dark seduction, the Machiavellian operates through what we call instrumental intimacy, the strategic deployment of pseudo-connection. The tactical playbook. Target assessment. They profile potential partners for exploitability markers: loneliness, low self-esteem, recent trauma, high empathy. These aren't seen as human vulnerabilities, they're attack vectors. Mirroring protocol. They employ sophisticated behavioral mimicry, matching communication style, values, even trauma narratives to create false resonance. Neuroscientists call this strategic empathy, understanding without feeling. Variable reinforcement. They've intuitively mastered operant conditioning. By providing intermittent validation and withdrawal, they create what behaviorists call a partial reinforcement extinction effect, making their targets more persistent, more desperate, more addicted. Gaslighting architecture. They systematically distort the target's perception of reality to maintain control. This isn't anger, it's engineering. The brutal truth. To the Machiavellian, you are not a person, you are a resource node to be optimized. And the most chilling part? This view is held with complete emotional neutrality.
Subclinical psychopathy, the cold core. We now arrive at the most misunderstood and most dangerous component, subclinical psychopathy. Critical distinction. We're not discussing criminal psychopaths. We're examining individuals with psychopathic traits below clinical thresholds, what researchers call successful psychopaths or corporate psychopaths. They're functional, often successful, and statistically, you've dated one. Core feature, the cool syndrome. Psychopathy researchers like Dr. Kent Keel have identified the neurological signature, paralimbic dysfunction, specifically amygdala hypoactivity, reduced emotional learning, particularly fear conditioning. They don't experience anticipatory anxiety about consequences. Reduced anterior cingulate engagement. This region typically processes social pain and empathic distress. In psychopathic individuals, watching suffering produces minimal activation. Prefrontal amygdala disconnection. The emotional brake system doesn't function. They can cognitively understand that hurting you is wrong, but feel no instinctive aversion to causing harm. Behavioral manifestations. Emotional immunity. They experience emotions in a fundamentally different way, shallow, short-lived, primarily self-focused. Dr. Robert Hare describes it as knowing the words but not the music of emotional life. Absence of remorse. Not because they're evil, but because the neurocircuitry that generates guilt doesn't activate. Hurting you creates no more emotional feedback than deleting a file on a computer. Thrill-seeking and boredom susceptibility. Chronically under-aroused nervous system. They require intense stimulation, including the hunt of seduction, to feel alive. The dark seduction advantage. Psychopathic traits provide what we call emotional invulnerability, the soft touch immunity. When a partner displays distress, crying, pleading, explaining their pain, neurotypical individuals experience empathic resonance. Mirror neurons fire, the anterior insula activates, and they feel compelled to respond. This creates the chain of obligation. The subclinical psychopath? Nothing. Your tears don't manipulate them because they don't experience the neurochemical discomfort that tears are designed to trigger. They might simulate concern. They're excellent actors, but internally, there's no empathic hijack.
Strategic implications. They can walk away from any interaction without psychological cost. They never experience the one-itis that paralyzes their targets. They can simultaneously pursue multiple partners without cognitive dissonance or guilt. They're immune to emotional blackmail, manipulation, or appeals to conscience. The clinical reality. Imagine playing poker against someone who genuinely doesn't care if they lose. They call every bluff, make every risky play, and show zero emotional reaction to any outcome. You're playing by rules they don't feel.
The integrated system. Here's where it gets truly sophisticated. These traits don't operate in isolation. They form an integrated psychological operating system. Synergistic effects. Narcissism provides the motivation, the need for validation and status. Machiavellianism provides the strategy, how to exploit others effectively. Psychopathy provides the execution capacity, emotional immunity to consequences. The neural capital insight, detachment as asset. The Dark Triad individual's primary advantage is systematic detachment from the attachment circuitry that governs normal human pair bonding. Think about this. In evolutionary terms, romantic love is a commitment device, a neurochemical hijacking system that forces us to remain bonded even when immediate costs outweigh benefits. It's beautiful, but it's also a vulnerability. The chain of obligation. When you love someone, you become hostage to their well-being. Their pain produces your pain through empathic resonance. Their withdrawal threatens your dopaminergic reward system. Their approval becomes necessary for your emotional homeostasis. You are, neurologically speaking, no longer free. The Dark Triad Advantage. They never enter this chain. They engage in relationships from a position of permanent outcome independence because they genuinely don't need the outcome. They don't need your love. They don't fear your abandonment. They experience no cognitive dissonance from exploiting you. This creates asymmetric warfare. You're fighting with your nervous system bound. They're fighting completely unencumbered. You experience their withdrawal as pain. They experience your withdrawal as irrelevance. You need resolution, closure, understanding. They need nothing. The brutal equation. In any negotiation, the person who cares least has the most power. The Dark Triad individual is constitutionally incapable of caring more than you. They always hold the power position.
So what do we do with this information? First, recognize the pattern. Dark Triad traits exist on a spectrum, and they're far more common than you think. Studies suggest 1 to 5% of the population exhibits significant Dark Triad clustering. That's millions of individuals. Second, understand the asymmetry. You cannot out-manipulate someone who doesn't experience the emotional feedback loops you rely on. You cannot make them understand your pain if their neural architecture doesn't process emotional empathy. You cannot win them back because they were never truly attached in the first place. Third, weaponize awareness. The Dark Triad toolkit only works on targets who don't recognize it. Pattern recognition is your countermeasure. Once you see the system, you're no longer exploitable by it. In our next module, we'll examine the specific behavioral techniques Dark Triad individuals deploy, the manipulation playbook, and more importantly, the psychological vulnerabilities they target in you. Because here's the real question: why do these tactics work so effectively? What is it about your psychological architecture that makes you susceptible? That's what we'll explore in Module 2, the exploitation vectors. This is Neural Capital. Stay sharp.
Subscribe if you want to understand the game being played behind the game. And remember, knowledge is the only advantage that can't be taken from you.